Most people believe that when a police officer smiles at them during a traffic stop, it means everything is going fine, that the tension is easing, that the officer is being friendly. But after years of sitting in courtrooms, reviewing body camera footage frame by frame, and listening to officers testify under oath about what they were thinking during those exact moments, I can tell you something that makes a lot of people uncomfortable. Sometimes the moment an officer smiles at you is the moment the real investigation begins. Not the ticket, not the warning, the investigation. Now, before anyone misunderstands what I'm saying, let me be clear about something. Police officers are human beings. Some of them genuinely are polite. Some of them genuinely try to keep interactions calm. A smile does not automatically mean manipulation. But here's the part most people never see. In hundreds of suppression hearings, I've watched officers explain their tactics in very plain language. Not emotional language, not dramatic language, just procedural language. The kind of language that sounds almost boring until you realize what it actually means. And one phrase comes up again and again. We try to build rapport. That's the word, rapport. And rapport, in the context of a roadside stop, is not about friendship. It's about lowering your guard. Because the truth about traffic stops, something the public rarely sees, is that the legal power of a stop is actually very limited in the beginning. When an officer pulls you over for speeding, a broken taillight, or a rolling stop sign, the law allows them to investigate that violation. They can check your license, they can verify registration, they can run your information, they can issue a citation or warning, but that's supposed to be the scope. And here's where this gets complicated. Officers are also trained to look for other crimes, drugs, guns, warrants, DUI, anything. The problem is that the legal threshold for expanding a traffic stop is supposed to be higher than simple curiosity. The officer needs additional reasonable suspicion that another crime is happening. So what happens when there isn't any obvious evidence? That's where rapport comes in, because conversation creates opportunity. Opportunity creates ambiguity, and ambiguity can be used to justify suspicion. Let me paint you a scene that I've seen hundreds of times on body camera footage. Blue lights flash behind a car on a dark highway. The driver pulls over. Heart rate climbs instantly. Anyone who says they don't feel adrenaline during a stop is either lying or has never actually been pulled over. The officer walks up. He leans down, and he smiles. Hey there, how's your night going? Now that question sounds harmless, friendly even, but think about it for a moment. The officer already knows why he stopped you. You don't know what he's looking for yet. And that small imbalance of information is where everything begins. You answer the question. Maybe you say you're doing fine. Maybe you say you're tired. Maybe you mention you're coming from dinner. Maybe you laugh nervously. Maybe you talk too much. And in that moment, something subtle happens. The stop slowly begins shifting from a traffic violation into a conversation. Now, this is the part most people misunderstand. Conversation during a police stop is not neutral territory. Every word you say becomes data. Where you came from, where you're going, how long you stayed, whether your answers are consistent, whether you hesitate, whether your voice shakes, whether your story changes. And while all of that is happening, the officer is also observing things most drivers never think about. Your breathing, your hands, your eye movement, whether you look toward the passenger seat, whether you glance at the trunk, whether you reach for anything. Because officers are trained to interpret behavior, sometimes correctly, sometimes incorrectly. But interpretation is the key word, and interpretation thrives in gray areas. Which brings me to the phrase I want you to remember through this entire conversation, a phrase that anchors everything we're talking about. The phrase is simple. I'm not answering questions, not aggressively, not sarcastically, not loudly, just calmly. I'm not answering questions. Now let me be honest with you about something, because a lot of internet advice about police stops is unrealistic. Saying that phrase will not magically end the stop. It will not make the officer turn around and walk back to the patrol car immediately. And yes, sometimes it will make the interaction feel more uncomfortable, but discomfort is not the same thing as illegality, and this is where the law matters. Under the Fifth Amendment, you have the right not to answer questions that could potentially incriminate you. That protection applies even when you haven't done anything wrong, because the law recognizes something very important about human behavior. People say things they shouldn't say when they're nervous, and traffic stops are one of the most psychologically stressful everyday encounters most citizens ever experience. Adrenaline spikes, your brain moves faster, your judgment gets sloppy, you try to be helpful, you try to appear cooperative, you try to prove you're innocent, and ironically, that's exactly when people start creating problems for themselves. I've watched body cam footage where a driver talks for 5 straight minutes about where they came from, what restaurant they visited, who they were with, what time they left, what route they took, why they're tired, why they're nervous, and by the end of the conversation, the officer has spotted 3 inconsistencies that become the foundation for reasonable suspicion. None of those inconsistencies would exist if the driver had simply said calmly, "I'm not answering questions." Now here's where it turns, because officers are aware of this dynamic too, which is why the smile matters. A smile lowers resistance. A friendly tone encourages talking. A casual conversation creates the illusion that nothing serious is happening. But in the background, a legal record is quietly forming. The officer's report later might say something like, "The driver appeared unusually nervous. The driver provided inconsistent travel plans. The driver avoided eye contact. The driver hesitated when answering." Those sentences become justification for prolonging the stop, for calling a K9 unit, for requesting consent to search, and that's how a routine speeding stop turns into a 40-minute roadside investigation. Let me tell you about a case that illustrates exactly how this works. A man was driving late at night on a highway outside a small town. He was stopped for drifting slightly over the fog line. That alone is a legitimate reason for a stop in many states. The officer approached the car smiling, friendly, conversational. The driver answered every question. "Where are you coming from?" "A friend's house." "Which friend?" "A college friend." "What's his name?" Mike." "Where does Mike live?" "Somewhere in the next town over." Already the officer senses hesitation. Then the officer asks where the driver is heading. "Home." "Where's home?" The driver gives a town name. But a few minutes later, during casual conversation, the driver mentions a different city while describing his job. That small discrepancy becomes the officer's justification. Now there's confusion about travel plans. The stop continues. A K9 unit arrives. The dog alerts. The car is searched. Drugs are discovered in the trunk. Now, whether the driver was guilty or innocent isn't the point of the story. The point is how the stop expanded. It expanded through conversation. Which brings us back to the central phrase, "I'm not answering questions." And here's where this gets complicated again, because asserting that phrase does not mean refusing to cooperate entirely. You still provide identification if the law requires it. You still comply with lawful orders like stepping out of the vehicle if instructed, but you draw a line between compliance and conversation. That line is what protects you legally. Now let me give you a hard truth that a lot of people don't want to hear. Asserting your rights may make the encounter take longer. It may make the officer suspicious. It may even lead to additional scrutiny. That's the reality. But rights were never designed to guarantee comfort. They were designed to create legal boundaries, and those boundaries matter enormously later in court. Because when a defense attorney files a motion to suppress evidence, the timeline of the stop becomes critical. How long did the officer take to write the ticket? What justification existed to prolong the detention? What facts created reasonable suspicion? And if the only thing that extended the stop was casual fishing through conversation, that's a very different legal argument. Now let me talk about psychology for a moment, because this part fascinates me after watching so many body camera recordings. Officers are trained to read behavior, but human behavior under stress is incredibly messy. People sweat when they're innocent. People shake when they're innocent. People avoid eye contact when they're innocent. People talk too much when they're innocent. And unfortunately, many of those reactions get interpreted as signs of guilt, which creates a feedback loop. The officer sees nervousness. The officer asks more questions. The driver becomes more nervous. The officer interprets that as confirmation. The cycle continues. This is why limiting conversation can actually stabilize the interaction. When you calmly repeat the phrase, "I'm not answering questions," you remove the fuel that drives that loop. No inconsistencies, no over-explaining, no accidental admissions, just a quiet legal boundary. Now you might be wondering what body language matters during this moment, because words are only part of communication. The rest is posture. movement, tone. If you assert your rights aggressively, leaning forward, raising your voice, rolling your eyes, you change the emotional temperature of the stop, and that rarely helps. But calm stillness is powerful. Hands visible, voice steady, eyes forward. I'm not answering questions. No argument, no lecture, no hostility, just repetition. And repetition matters because officers often try multiple conversational angles. They might ask about travel plans, then work, then passengers, then the car, then something casual like, "You seem nervous, is there something in the vehicle I should know about?" That question is a classic psychological pivot. It invites confession, it invites explanation, it invites the driver to clear the air. But again, the phrase holds the line. I'm not answering questions. Now here's another gray area people rarely discuss. Sometimes officers ignore the phrase. They continue asking questions. They change tone. They act puzzled. They may even say something like, "Why not? If you haven't done anything wrong, why wouldn't you answer?" This is the trap. Because the moment you start defending your refusal, you're back in conversation. So the response stays the same. I'm not answering questions. Calm. Neutral. Unemotional. Let me be honest with you about something else. Many officers expect people not to know this phrase. Because most drivers don't. Most drivers believe they must talk. That silence equals guilt. But the law does not treat silence as evidence of wrongdoing in this context, and that legal protection exists precisely because of the psychological pressure inherent in police encounters. Now, before anyone takes this the wrong way, understand something important. This is not advice about how to beat the police. It's advice about how to protect yourself in a system where misunderstandings happen constantly, where nervous words become evidence, where casual conversation becomes investigative strategy, where a friendly smile may simply be the opening move of a longer process. And that brings us full circle. If a cop smiles at you, something isn't necessarily wrong, but something might be starting. The shift from traffic enforcement to investigation often begins with friendliness, with rapport, with questions that sound harmless. And the most powerful tool you have in that moment isn't aggression. It isn't debate. It isn't trying to out-argue an officer on the side of the road. It's a simple boundary. I'm not answering questions. A phrase backed by constitutional law. A phrase that prevents accidental self-incrimination. A phrase that removes the ambiguity investigators often rely on. But like any tool, it only works if you can say it under pressure. And pressure is exactly what traffic stops create. So here's the final thing I tell clients when we talk about this. Don't wait until flashing lights are in your rearview mirror to think about what you'll say. Rehearse it, quietly, calmly. I'm not answering questions, because when adrenaline hits, your brain doesn't rise to the occasion. It falls back on habit. And the drivers who handle these encounters best are not the ones who try to improvise clever responses in the moment. They're the ones who already know exactly where their boundary is and exactly how to say it.